Today's episode is sponsored by Action Heat, makers of the world's best battery-heated clothing. Action Heat clothing is engineered to safely and efficiently deliver heat via heating panels similar to heated car seats. They offer jackets, socks, gloves, hats, and base layer shirts and long johns. I took their base layer shirt out for a hike in the cold the other day, and it definitely did the job. I used the lowest heat setting while walking so I wouldn't overheat, but turned it up to medium when I stopped for a break to keep from cooling down. As a special deal for our listeners, you can save 20% off your entire order by going to actionheat.com/best to check out everything Action Heat has to offer. That's actionheat.com/best, or use the coupon code BEST at checkout to save 20%. Stay toasty warm while you enjoy all your outdoor activities this winter with Action Heat. And now, welcome to this episode of the award-winning Best of the Left podcast, in which we shall learn about the literal and figurative bloody messes of the history of Thanksgiving and the identities of Native peoples. Clips today come from Code Switch, Democracy Now!, In the Thick, Science for the People, and Intercepted.
A lot of people out there are conflicted about this very American holiday, and, for good reason. People like Elizabeth Hoover, she's part Mohawk, and she's an American Studies professor at Brown University.
So I'm of two minds about Thanksgiving. The general sentiment that people have today about this holiday is that it's supposed to be a time that you get together with your family and you talk about the things that you are thankful for, and you have a big meal. And that's really what the holiday should just be.
But that's hard to swallow, Hoover says, if you know the real history behind Thanksgivings.
Thanksgiving, by the English, was after massacres. So after events like the Pequot Massacre, where the English went in and burned people alive in their homes, and then everybody who ran out to try to avoid the flames was stabbed and shot. And so after the return of the English from that event, that was labeled as a Thanksgiving. And the Pilgrims' idea of Thanksgiving was not a big meal, sit around and hang out and have a nice time. They spent the entire day in cold churches praying. So it was a very different kind of event than we're celebrating today.
There was a meal, though, in the 1620s. It's a meal that Hoover describes really as a tense business meeting between the white colonists and the Wampanoag people. It bore almost no resemblance to the story that most of us know today. Indians and Pilgrims sitting down, chilling, having a peaceful feast, that whole thing. It wasn't until 1863 that Abraham Lincoln made Thanksgiving a national holiday as a way to unite the country after the Civil War.
The spread of that happy Thanksgiving meal myth, says Hoover, papered over the fact that within a generation of the tense meal that took place in the 1600s, there was the attempted genocide of Native Americans across the U.S.
On the holiday that's now reserved as Thanksgiving, some people take that opportunity to just get together with their relatives and have a nice meal, and some people organize protests and different events to try to make America more aware of the real history around this time and that the Pilgrims were not great people. So I guess that's my Thanksgiving spiel.
As much of the United States prepares to mark Thanksgiving this weekend, many Native Americans will gather in Plymouth to commemorate the 47th National Day of Mourning. This year is dedicated to water protectors at Standing Rock and to the struggle for recognition of Indigenous Peoples Day. To discuss this and more, we're joined in San Francisco by Indigenous historian and activist Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. She's the author of An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States and co-author of All the Real Indians Died Off and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Roxanne. Could you tell us, as the nation prepares to observe Thanksgiving, a national holiday ostensibly meant to honor Native people, what are your thoughts?
Well, thank you for having me on the show. Actually, it's never been about honoring Native Americans. It's been about the origin story of the United States, the beginning of genocide, dispossession, and constant warfare from that time, actually from 1607 in Jamestown, until the present. It's a colonial system that was set up. There's a sort of annual calendar for this origin story, beginning with Columbus, October 12th. Why celebrate Columbus? It was the onset of colonialism, the slave trade, and dispossession of the native people of the Americas. So that is celebrated with a federal holiday. That's followed then by Thanksgiving, which is a completely made-up story to say the native people welcomed these people who were going to devastate their civilizations, which is simply a lie. And then you go to President's Days, the Founding Fathers in February, and celebrate these slave owners, Indian killers. George Washington headed the Virginia militia for the very purpose of killing Native people on the periphery of the colony. Before, when it was still a Virginia colony. And then we have the big day, the fireworks, July 4th, Independence, which is probably the most tragic event in world history because it gave the world a genocidal regime under the guise of democracy. And that's really I'm a historian, so that's the historical context that I think we have to see Thanksgiving in, that it is a part of that mythology that attempts to cover up the real history of the United States. It actually, when it was introduced as a holiday by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, there was no mention of pilgrims and Native people or food or pumpkins or anything like that. It was simply a day for families to be together and mourn their dead and be grateful for the living. And I think that's an appropriate holiday that how people should enjoy it. But they should take Native Americans and Puritans out of the picture for it to be a legitimate holiday of feast and sharing with family and friends. So that's, the people at Plymouth. I send greetings to them. They have, for many years, I think it's almost 40 years now, that stood up and testified to the lie of Plymouth Rock, the Mayflower, the Pilgrims. And this is very hard for people to give up. This is the nationalism. It's actually Americanism is white supremacy and represents negative things. There's almost no way to reconcile it. It simply has to be deconstructed and faced up to, and otherwise there will be no social change that's meaningful for anyone.
I just want to state that before we start with a lot of these really important numbers, I think if we think about the fact that Native American women have always been kind of seen as a threat, it gives us a context for what we're seeing in the United States today. Like they were the first ones who were dealing with being seen as other on their own land. And that's a legacy that we can't forget when we're talking about these data points. So listen to this and just take note. So it's estimated that every year, 300 Indigenous women and girls go missing in the United States and Canada. And 4 out of 5 Native American women will experience violence in their lifetimes. More than half will survive domestic violence or sexual assault. The CDC reported that in 2016, the third leading cause of death for Native American and Alaskan Native women ages 10 to 24. Third leading cause of death is murder. For women 25 to 34, it's the fourth leading cause of death. The National Crime Information Database reports that as of 2016, there were nearly 6,000 missing and murdered Indigenous women. And all of this is fueling the fight for a hashtag that, is just not as mainstream as Me Too. And it's the hashtag MMIWG movement, which stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls.
Yeah, but it's not just about the numbers. It's part of the daily life of many Indigenous women in these two countries. The Intercept explains that this is a movement that originated, quote, from the fact that so many Indigenous women knew someone who has died violently or disappeared, and that it identifies the generations-long elimination of thousands of women from Indigenous communities as a direct result of government attempts to eliminate Indigenous culture.
Right. And I guess we have to put it in that context.
Yeah.
Jenny, again, as an Indigenous Native American, help us to understand the bigger picture of this issue and its historical context and why this needs to matter to us now amidst everything that's going on.
Well, I think what's important is that while this issue is generating a lot of interest right now, and I think that's the big takeaway, the high note is that there is finally attention being paid for people like me and Anita and a lot of other people in Indian country. This issue is far from new. In fact, there's a real common understanding among our people that the reality is we hardly know anyone who may not have been touched by violence. And that's how severe this situation is. While the hashtag is about missing and murdered Indigenous women, there's an overarching theme of violence that has just run through our narrative across generations. And I think to really understand this issue, you cannot ignore that kind of trauma on that kind of level.
Right. And it's important, like I said before, that the data, it plays an important role in creating awareness of this epidemic of violence and understanding the issue. And Anita, like Maria said, you've been building the largest database of missing and murdered Indigenous women in the U.S. and Canada. And looking at what you've done, you've been collecting data back since the 1900s. You have a list of nearly 3,000 women. Over half of these cases are of murdered Indigenous women. A third are girls younger than 18 years old.
What is it with the young women?
I know. Mm-hmm. And it's something important about this data that it isn't public. You say, Anita, that the data is sacred and there are spirits represented within the data. So how did you begin collecting this information? What inspired you to do this? And what is this data showing about this violence that targets Indigenous women?
I started collecting the data when I found that, there are lists online. There are folks who have been working on this. I mean, I'm 27 and this movement has been around my whole life. So as Jenny was saying, this is something that's, run deep through our communities for a long time. So there are resources out there, but none of them match. Most aren't updated frequently. None of them include both Canada and the US. And so I felt like I had a responsibility to fill in that gap. Case in point, last night I was up till 3 a.m. updating the database. There's now over 3,000 cases in it. The number is now 3,032.
Whoa.
Yeah. And why is this so important to you?
For a couple reasons, partially because I'm a survivor of violence myself. I experienced domestic violence that almost killed me, and as well as other forms of violence. And so, if I hadn't been able to survive, I would want my story to have meaning. I would want to be part of the movement to make sure that that kind of violence doesn't happen to other generations of Indigenous women and girls. Beyond that, in terms of, the dedication to it and staying up till 3 a.m., this database has been a labor of love for the last 3 years, and I've been fortunate to get to meet so many families and community members who are just carrying so much grief and yet are also so resilient and so strong in wanting to advocate for their loved ones that, when you're surrounded by that for years, it becomes part of your daily life to be really dedicated to this.
So how are advances in genetic science and technology changing the conversation about membership, if it is at all?
Well, what has happened is I think it's pretty pervasive in the United States now, and I've also seen it among First Nations in Canada, that tribal governments are using DNA testing, but not the genetic ancestry testing that comes from human population genetics that I was talking about. They're using DNA parentage tests. So the DNA profile that's used in, say, for forensic science or criminal cases, or when you just need to do a paternity test. That's a really different kind of DNA test. But what they're doing is, quite often, if parentage is in question, it's paternity, obviously. And if somebody, say, needs to document their paternal line in order to show what their lineal descent is from a base roll, so the base tribal rolls that were put together around the allotment time, or if they need to prove their blood quantum, they may need that father's lineage. And if it's not sure that the person they're claiming as their father is their biological father, they'll come in and do a DNA test. This is pretty pervasive. Now, most tribes will do it on a case-by-case basis, but what you have seen, and this has gotten tribal enrollment even more bad press, is you've seen a very few very wealthy casino tribes with very small populations who divide up casino benefits among individual tribal members. And in those very wealthy tribes, this can be $1 million a year or something per member. Those tribes have moved to across the board DNA testing. And they have actually ended up, of course, if you go into a room and you DNA test everybody for parentage, you're going to come out with some falsely attributed biological parentage in there. You could have it as high as 10%. People don't have the biological father they think they have. So that's what happens if you go in and test a whole population, right? And then some people have gotten thrown off the rolls because they were tracing their descent from somebody listed on a base roll, and there's a break there in lineage, right?
So you go into depth in your book about how genetic testing companies are very specifically targeting Native American people and tribes. At least some of them are. What's going on here, and why are they targeting Native American tribes specifically?
Well, so I've seen DNA testing companies pop up that are selling the genetic ancestry test to the public, people that are interested in researching their family tree, and that's all really interesting. But they might also offer paternity tests, because I think there's probably, I don't know what the breakdown is in terms of profit, but there's a good market for paternity testing. And so these same companies who might have, researchers involved that are doing the genetic ancestry stuff are also, trying to make money off selling paternity tests. And so, they're trying to make money, right? And so they'll go to tribal conferences. There are different national tribal conferences that happen, and they'll set up with a lot of, at the trade show that happens. I've seen this happen at National Congress of American Indians, which is a huge annual conference. I've heard of it happening at the National Indian Gaming Association conferences, where they'll set up on the trade show floor and talk to tribes about DNA testing. So, they're companies trying to make money like anybody else. I don't see an agenda beyond that, although what I do see them doing is sort of preaching this idea that there is some scientifically objective way to do your membership based on DNA testing. And of course, that's not true. Membership is highly politicized. It's highly subjective. And you can decide to plug a DNA test in to support those political decisions or not. But there is no scientifically neutral way to decide who should be a member of a tribe or not.
You talk a little bit in the book about some of the problematic messaging that you were seeing in some of the marketing efforts, things about being able to scientifically tell whether or not someone's ancestry belongs to a very specific tribe.
Right, which is completely false. And what that tells me is that the genetic scientists doing this work don't understand the way that tribe is defined. They are conflating a tribal community or a First Nation with a biological or a genetic population. Now, first of all, on the scientific front, there's already huge debates and problems with acting as if any genetic population is ever a discrete thing. So you've got lots of social scientists and historians of science who really take to task scientists who use the word population in a way that retains too many old school racial ideas. That's a whole body of literature. But aside from that, aside from the problems with how one defines population genetically, we also have how one defines a tribe socially and politically. And scientists, for the most part, don't understand that history. So tribes are certainly comprised of people that are related biologically, but you have to go back to the era of colonization, largely in the 19th century, post-Indian Wars, when the reservation era happened, and you had different bands of people put together on different reservations, these large, thriving, intricately connected indigenous communities and kinship groups were kind of severed and put onto these little reservation land bases. And so they, for example, made tribes out of peoples that hadn't previously maybe been living that closely together. They put multiple tribes onto one reservation. Again, everything was designed for the ease of land management and Indian containment by the federal government. So geneticists go into these communities, and what they're interested in is taking a sample from a person who ideally has 4 grandparents who are from that quote unquote tribe. They're looking for a level of populational purity that just can't exist when these tribes are placed on these land bases during a time of colonial relocation and removal, not to mention all of the ways in which indigenous people move around in the 20th century. There was relocation to boarding schools. There was the termination era in the 1950s in which the federal government terminated tribes, tried to take away native status from people, and then they found out that didn't work as an assimilation tactic, so they reconstituted tribes. There is the fact that a native person from one tribe might go to boarding school somewhere and meet somebody who's Navajo, and then they get together and they have children, and so suddenly you've got these indigenous people who have lineages in multiple official tribal communities. I mean, it's like they think that native people just sit around on the reservation and marry each other and never move around. We're highly mobile post-colonization, and our ancestors were highly mobile pre-colonization. So this conflation of assuming that a tribe is a biological population is kind of scientifically nonsensical, and it's politically and socially nonsensical.
As a listener of this show, you already know that big corporations are getting rich from selling your data. And thanks to Congress and the FCC failing to save net neutrality or protect our privacy online, internet providers and mobile carriers like Comcast and Verizon are free to restrict websites, spy on your online activity, or sell your browsing history to advertisers. In short, you simply have to be proactive to protect your privacy. And with one click, ExpressVPN shields your online activity from internet and mobile providers, hackers, and spies. ExpressVPN has easy-to-use apps that run seamlessly in the background of your computer, phone, and tablet, securing and anonymizing your internet browsing by encrypting your data and hiding your public IP address. I have ExpressVPN set up on all of my devices, and I've never had a single problem. No wonder ExpressVPN is rated the #1 VPN service by TechRadar. You can get ExpressVPN protection for less than $7 a month, and it comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you have nothing to lose but all those electric prying eyes following you around the web. To take back your internet privacy today and find out how you can get 3 months free, go to expressvpn.com/left. That's expressvpn.com/left for 3 months free with a 1-year package. Visit expressvpn.com/left to learn more.
I'd like to know, just so we make it really clear to people, because I think when you hear this, it is really shocking.
Right.
That you can be an American citizen or of any place. Mm-hmm. And if you commit a crime, such as rape, inside a reservation, you cannot be charged by the Native American justice, the courts, the police. And so is it, in fact, Anita and Jenny, kind of like, I mean, people know this, having spent some time on reservations in different states. People obviously know what you can do on a reservation and what you can't do. Mm. I'm going to use a very ugly term, but is it a kind of hunting season? Because these men know that they can literally get away with murder, right? Because they're non-native.
I think vulnerability plays a big role in predatory behavior on tribal lands. We certainly saw that in the Bakken fields in North Dakota, where I don't think a lot of people realize this, but they had to establish an FBI agency there because violent crimes had surged so highly, and many of those violent crimes were on Native women. And it had been the first bureau that the FBI had opened in like over a decade. So yeah, I think that vulnerability does play a huge role. But I would also say that there have been strides in responding to violence in tribal communities. The Violence Against Women Act squarely addresses what the Major Crimes Act hadn't done for tribes, which is managing their own justice affairs. Mm-hmm. And you can't really look at that story without looking at how tribes had always been managing their own justices. And it's in part because of the federal government that has done this and broken that system. And so there's been a steady pace for tribes to beef up their court systems and to allow for the prosecution of non-Native offenders on their tribal lands. But that is imperfect as well because it just limits non-Native offenders. And, it is a very sensitive topic, but predators are not, exclusive of race.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, Jenny, because I know that I was shocked by just like the legal issues around this.
Right.
But you're right. We cannot forget about the fact that some of this oftentimes is coming from within our own community.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a sensitive topic to talk about because, right, I mean, especially if you're coming from tribal community, it's one that hasn't healed. And I don't know, I think that cycle of healing is going to happen for a long, long time.
Right.
And it's certainly not lost on our Indigenous communities. It's one that I think our men are really realizing, the leadership of our men are really realizing that. I think if we're going to really take a stern look at this issue, it has to come from within.
I'd like to add, too, that this is an issue that extends well beyond tribal lands as well. And the rates of conviction or, rates of justice, whatever you want to call it, mm-hmm. are abysmal off of reservations, too. So, for example, the Urban Indian Health Institute just released a report. They studied sexual violence among urban Native women in Seattle. They found 94% of the survey participants had experienced sexual violence, and only 8% had seen their perpetrator convicted.
Wow.
And so even in an urban environment, we're seeing that law enforcement are not handling these cases properly, not following up as they should, and communicating to Native women that this kind of violence is okay. And that shows perpetrators as well. One of the things that I like to remind people is that we've had generations of people grow up on Tiger Lily, Pocahontas. Now we have Twilight, where the only Native woman is a domestic violence victim who doesn't have any lines. Or recently Hostels came out, and the Native women also don't have any lines and are rape victims. When that's the only way that you ever see Native women, and you don't see anyone ever be held accountable for that violence, it's easy to see that, to see us as objects rather than human beings, regardless of where we are.
I'm talking to a daughter and her mom in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
I'm Taylor Payer, and I'm the daughter of Delima Payer.
And I'm Delima Payer.
Taylor and Delima are citizens of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians. They're sitting in Taylor's house, where Taylor lives with her younger sister. Delima is in town visiting.
From Belcourt, North Dakota.
And Taylor and Delima are letting me overhear one of their favorite family discussions, finding the right man to donate his sperm to Taylor, who's gay. She really wants a baby and to co-parent.
My mom will often, I think, see people around either on the reservation, maybe even on my Facebook, and will call excitedly about maybe they're really handsome, they seem eligible in some way.
I tease them. Ooh, that young man has baby-making hips.
But baby-making hips isn't enough.
So he's got to be Native, but what else do you want him to be?
Oh my gosh, they gotta be smart.
Smart or not, the emphasis is on that Native part. And he doesn't even just gotta be Native, as Taylor puts it. He's gotta have a certain amount of Native blood. Their tribe's longevity depends on it. And here's why. For enrollment, there are some tribes like the Cherokee or Chickasaw nations that use this thing called lineal descent, so their ancestors just have to be enrolled. But for Turtle Mountain, they use something else called blood quantum.
Blood quantum, simply, is the amount of, quote, Indian blood that an individual possesses.
This is Elizabeth Rule. She's a PhD candidate at Brown University, and she specializes in Native American studies. She told me that some tribes say you have to have a certain amount of, quote, Indian blood to be considered a citizen. And different tribes use blood quantum in enrollment in different ways. Like the Navajo Nation, for instance. It says you have to have a quarter Navajo blood to enroll. But Turtle Mountain, Taylor's tribe, it requires that people have at least 25% of any native blood with some combination of Turtle Mountain. Elizabeth Rule told me there's really no set method for how blood quantum is determined.
So the quantum is a fraction of blood that is derived going back to the original enrollees of a tribe who were counted on census or rolls, and then their blood quantum was documented. And usually those original enrollees had a full blood quantum, typically.
But how did people know that those original enrollees had a quote-unquote full blood quantum?
Well, they didn't. And that's one of the major problems with blood quantum today, is that a lot of times the people taking the rolls were federal government officials who were unfamiliar with Native ways of establishing and defining their own communities.
In other words, blood quantum is not this scientific thing. It's subjective, political. Whatever the case, Elizabeth Rule says blood quantum, it could mean a lot for enrollment.
Not having a child that's an enrolled tribal member is equivalent to not maintaining citizenship within the same country as your child.
Having a kid who can't be enrolled has very real consequences. It can affect a lot of different things.
Where that child goes to school, where you can live, what types of services you have access to, what elections you can vote in.
She puts it this way, in the context of family and nation. Tribal sovereignty, tribal nationhood, has not always been widely accepted. The U.S. federal government didn't want to recognize tribes as their own separate nations at various points in the 1700s, or 1800s, or 1900s. And one outcome was that the federal government treated Native Americans as a racial group instead of citizens of their own tribes.
American Indians have certainly been racialized, and we see that from cartoons, caricatures, mascots. It's really been a societal project to racialize what is actually a very diverse group of political entities and sovereign nations.
And this is where blood quantum comes in.
Blood quantum emerged as a way to measure Indianness through a construct of race, so that over time, Indians would literally breed themselves out and rid the federal government of their legal duties to uphold treaty obligations.
In other words, if you don't have a baby with the right person, your tribe could eventually die out, which brings us back to Minneapolis and Taylor Payer. Even though lots of people see blood quantum as this major thing, for a long time, growing up in North Dakota on the reservation, Taylor didn't even know what blood quantum was. She tells me about this moment. She was 16.
So when I went in after I got my license to get this ID, which is something I needed to apply to scholarships and to college to prove that I was Native American and federally recognized, that's actually the first time I learned my blood quantum.
She got this card, her tribal identification card, from Turtle Mountain's branch of the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
It's a picture ID. It has your name, your date, a recent photo. A lot of times, including my tribe, it includes your blood quantum.
Taylor stared at the card.
And it said the fraction right on there, and it was sort of a lot less than I would have ever thought.
What was it? Are you willing to share?
Sure, yeah. So it is 5/16, which is sort of a funny fraction. And in my tribe, you need to be 1/4, 1/4 to be enrolled.
So you're right above that.
Yep, right above. So my mom has a slightly higher blood quantum than I do, and my dad has a slightly less blood quantum.
It felt weird asking Taylor her fraction and hearing her talk like it'd been calculated and told to her on official paper, which it had. I told Taylor that, and she agreed. These fractions are bizarre. She's not sure why her fraction is 5/16. Her family doesn't know either, but her general sense is that somewhere in her family line, back when the Bureau of Indian Affairs decided who was or wasn't Native, some arbitrary decision was made.
You know, it's dogs, Indians, and horses that get this paper with your degree of blood on it. It's sort of the purebred thing, and it's put on humans. It's put on Native American human beings, and it's a very strange thing.
So it's a no-brainer that lots of people see blood quantum as this insidious thing, a way for the federal government to slowly diminish the Native population, to make Native Americans a racial group instead of belonging to their own nations. But if blood quantum is slowly squeezing out a tribe's population, why keep it? I asked Elizabeth Rule this, and she describes it as this colonial catch-22. When she was studying the different systems of enrollment, like blood quantum or lineal descent, where if your ancestors are in, you are too, she says she noticed that Native people on both sides all used this language about survival.
Those who defend blood quantum requirements also evoke this language of survival, and they look upon those blood quantum minimums as a way to preserve an already existing closed community that's very close.
In other words, some people who support blood quantum rules, they don't want to have people enrolling as citizens in their tribe when they have very little connection to it.
There have been cases where outsiders want to jump on the bandwagon and claim Indian heritage for their own personal gain.
And Rule, she says, it all really comes down to how these tribal nations define community. After all, whatever these tribes decide, it's their right to decide it as their own sovereign nations. And this conflict, it's something that DeLima and Taylor are always thinking about.
Our research is saying that it's, how do I want to put that? That we're losing our nativeness.
Yeah, like we'll die out or something like that.
Right.
So even though Taylor doesn't agree with an enrollment system that uses blood quantum, she can't just pretend it doesn't exist.
I weighed the two by saying, I understand that Native folks who aren't enrolled are still indeed Native, and I selfishly would like my children to have an easier time identifying with their Native culture and get the sort of privileges that are afforded to federally recognized tribal members.
Today's episode is sponsored by Madison Reed. Amy Errett founded the company in 2013, naming it after her daughter with a mission to revolutionize the way women color their hair. As is so often the case, the status quo options either left much to be desired or cost way too much. Madison Reed offers the quality of a salon, the convenience and affordability of at-home hair color, and an ammonia-free formula with ingredients you can feel good about. You'll look like you just came from the salon, but without the huge time commitment. Experience beautiful, multi-dimensional hair color, made in Italy, delivered to your door on your schedule for under $25. Hundreds of thousands of women have already tried and loved Madison Reed, so go ahead and give it a try for yourself. You can start by finding your perfect shade at madison-reed.com, and they have a special offer for you as a Best of the Left listener. Right now you can get 10% off plus free shipping on your first color kit when you use the promo code LEFT. That's madison-reed.com and use promo code LEFT.
We continue to look at Senator Elizabeth Warren's claims to Native American ancestry. She's come under fire since releasing a DNA test showing Native American lineage in her family tree. In a video released Monday, she told her family's story.
My mother was born in eastern Oklahoma. It had been Indian territory until just a few years earlier when it had become a state. My daddy always said he fell head over heels in love with my mother the first time he saw her. But my daddy's parents, the Herrings, were bitterly opposed to their marrying because my mother's family, the Reeds, was part Native American. This sort of discrimination was common at the time. So when my mama was 19 and my daddy was 20, they eloped. And together they built a family, my 3 older brothers and me.
Elizabeth Warren has said her mother told her family had ties to the Cherokee and Delaware tribes. But Native Americans across the country are criticizing Warren's decision to use a DNA test to assert her heritage. Jack Hoskin Jr., Secretary of State for the Cherokee Nation, said, quote, sovereign tribal nations set their own legal requirements for citizenship, and while DNA tests can be used to determine lineage, such as paternity to an individual, it is not evidence for tribal affiliation. Using a DNA test to lay claim to any connection to the Cherokee Nation or any tribal nation, even vaguely, is inappropriate and wrong.
For more, we host a roundtable discussion. Joining us from Fargo, North Dakota, is Tara Hauska, National Campaign Director for Honor the Earth. She's an Ojibwe lawyer. And we go to Anchorage, Alaska, where we're joined by Mark Trahant, who is editor of Indian Country Today, a member of the Shoshone-Bannock tribes. In Seattle, Washington, we're joined by Jossie Ross, author, speaker, lawyer, and storyteller, member of the Blackfeet Nation, host of the podcast Breakdances with Wolves. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Let's go to North Dakota, to Tara Hauska. If you can respond first to Senator Warren releasing her DNA test indicating Native American lineage and her video, and your thoughts on this.
What I see are some non-Native folks arguing over what Native identity is, and Native people just being almost entirely left out of the conversation. So we saw that Lindsey Graham now is running around saying, that I have more Indian blood than she does. I should open a casino. It kind of shows just how problematic Senator Warren's decision to use this DNA test as her smoking gun. Now, see, I'm Native. I said I was. When in fact, common genetic markers and geographic location does not tell you anything about, which tribe you might be part of or that you might have descendancy from. She couldn't actually locate an ancestor, having done a genealogy study, who is a Native person. It's kind of this one drop rule that she's reinforcing all these, understandings of race being something by blood and there being this difference between different ethnicities. So
let's go to Senator Warren in her own words in that video that she released on Monday talking about her Native American heritage.
I'm not enrolled in a tribe, and only tribes determine tribal citizenship. I understand and respect that distinction, but my family history is my family history.
So that's Elizabeth Warren. Tara, can you respond to that and also explain how is it that Native American tribes determine membership?
Yeah, I think she's kind of walking back her words because she got this really harsh statement by Cherokee Nation, who is saying, that this is really disrespectful and has nothing to do with, their sovereign right to determine membership. I don't think that she's very regretful about this. I think that she's just kind of bowled her way forward on this issue. And, it's the sovereign right of tribal nations to determine who is a member. It is, relationships of kinship, of community, of a lived experience. It's all kinds of different factors that sometimes can include blood quantum, but blood quantum is something that was created by the colonial government, not by tribal nations. And it's this kind of myth that's been perpetuated by the United States and by many, many Americans who claim to be, quote unquote, part Cherokee, and continue these problematic ideas of who Native people are and were.
Let's turn to Republican Senator Lindsey Graham on Fox and Friends Tuesday, saying he plans to take a DNA test in response to Senator Warren.
I'm going to take a DNA test. All of you have. I've been told that my grandmother was part Cherokee and Indian. It may all be just talk, but you're going to find out in a couple of weeks because I'm going to take this test.
You are going to take it.
I'm taking it, and the results are going to be revealed here. This is my Trump moment. This is reality TV.
Why do you want to
I'm dying to know. Because I'm dying. I didn't really think much about it, but she's less than 1/10 of 1%. I think I can beat her. I think I can beat her.
Right, and if you do beat her, will you ask for $1 million from the president too?
No, I want a casino and $1 million.
I want a casino and $1 million, Tara Hauska. That was Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina.
Yeah, it's incredibly disrespectful, and just really shows how Warren's behavior, although it's less crude than some of the comments who've been made by Donald Trump about Pocahontas and demeaning women into this historic figure and making that into somehow a slur. Her behavior is less crude, but it's still problematic, and it's still a complete misunderstanding of what Native identity actually is, and it perpetuates this myth that so many people hold. I mean, you live on the East Coast and you hear almost everyone having this story of being part Cherokee on their mother's side, when there are real Cherokee people who still live today. And we should respect that and understand who Native people really are.
Well, I'd like to bring in Mark Trahant from Anchorage, Alaska. Could you also comment on this controversy? You've been extremely critical of the fact that Elizabeth Warren has taken a DNA test and released it. Could you explain what your problem with this is, your criticism?
Well, the DNA test itself is just another use of a colonial narrative, basically. The ultimate goal of a DNA test is to prove that Indians are immigrants like everybody else. And it's, again, it takes away from the idea that there's a tribal community with a governing institution that's been around before the United States. And there are reasons that tribes are around with 10,000-year histories in North America.
Well, Mark, can you explain what you mean by that? The DNA tests are there to prove that Indigenous people, Native Americans, are immigrants like everyone else. Why?
Kim Tallbear, who's written quite a bit about this, has talked about it's basically coming up with a narrative that says figure out where folks came from originally and trying to figure that out rather than to connect with the stories. I mean, Shoshone Bannock, for example, one of the things that just I love about my own people is that if you look at the history of North America, we once hunted mastodon. And you think about that as an arc of history that goes back many generations that is much deeper than a test that you can use.
I think it's safe to say that we're all sick of hearing about the Elizabeth Warren-Donald Trump battle over her claims to Native American ancestry. But bear with me for a moment. There are some important issues, both current and historical, that this made-for-TV episode raises. More than anything, it highlights the enduring colonialist mentality that reigns in the U.S., including even from progressive, high-profile Democrats like Elizabeth Warren. It also has shown the racist sentiments that have dominated the U.S. government's relationship with Native peoples continues unabated. Trump has long expressed contempt and has held racist views towards Native Americans. And he began calling Warren Pocahontas as a slur against the senator. Trump famously taunted Elizabeth Warren, daring her to take a DNA test to prove that she wasn't lying about claims to Indigenous ancestry.
And we will say, I will give you $1 million to your favorite charity, paid for by Trump, if you take the test and it shows you're an Indian,
Now, of course, that demand from Trump was absurd and insulting, but not to Elizabeth Warren primarily. It was insulting to Native communities that have been massacred, persecuted, erased, systematically marginalized by white colonialist political leaders in this country since its foundation. And it's because of this historical revisionism and trivialization and commodification of Native culture that we are having this obscene political moment of a president of the United States using Pocahontas as a slur. And you have sitting senators Warren and Lindsey Graham rushing to take DNA tests in a charade that further buries the real existential threats faced by tribes in this country. But that's all political theater. There are real, urgent life and death issues facing Native peoples. There's a war on the earth that's being led by the United States government. When Donald Trump came into office, he steamrolled the embattled activists at Standing Rock, greenlighting the Keystone XL pipeline and other pipeline projects that will leak, that will spill, that are going to poison enormous freshwater aquifer that irrigates much of the central U.S. Donald Trump is encouraging as much drilling for oil as possible, opening millions of acres offshore. At the same time, he is rolling back the already weak emission standards. He's opening protected land like Bears Ears National Monument for mining. He's embracing coal, which scientists have recently warned we need to unequivocally end using immediately.
We have ended the war on beautiful clean coal, and we are putting our great coal miners back to work.
In North Dakota recently, thousands of Native people have been disenfranchised from voting by a new voter ID law that will specifically threaten Native people because they don't have specific addresses listed on their nation's documentation. Yet instead of climate change, instead of voter disenfranchisement, instead of these existential threats and real issues facing Native communities, we're discussing Elizabeth Warren's DNA test on whether or not, as Trump says, she's an Indian. In a recent article for The Intercept, our next guest argues, quote, Indianness isn't defined by DNA. It's a legal, social, cultural, and historical construct where indigenous nations self-define the parameters of belonging. Put simply, it's not about who you claim, it's about who claims you. The author of that piece is Nick Estes. He's an Indigenous historian, writer, and assistant professor at the University of New Mexico. He is also the founder of Red Nation, and his latest piece for The Intercept was titled Native American Sovereignty is Under Attack. Here's how Elizabeth Warren's DNA test hurt our struggle. He is a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe and of the Ocheti Shakoi. Nick Estes, welcome to Intercepted.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
Just talk a bit about how Trump has used Native Americans, indigenous people, in his public pronouncements before and as president.
Right. So earlier, when Trump was building casinos out in the Northeast, he publicly baited tribes who were seeking federal recognition at a U.S. Senate hearing and basically said, you don't look like Indians to me.
They don't look like Indians to me. And they don't look like to Indians. Now, maybe we say politically correct or not politically correct. They don't look like Indians to me, and they don't look like Indians to Indians. And a lot of people are laughing at it, and you're telling how tough.
And so Trump has used indigeneity as a sort of a weapon against not just indigenous peoples, but anyone that he sees as a political opponent. And so leading up to him using and mobilizing Pocahontas as a slur against Elizabeth Warren, he has a track record as baiting people based on race, but also using indigeneity as a slur, as something that he and people like him can define based on appearance or based on a DNA test. So it's part of a longer sort of tradition of just Trump trolling women, trolling Mexicans, trolling immigrants to this country and using them as political fodder to, antagonize racial animosity.
And what about his use of the term Pocahontas and that name as frequently as he does, to the point where he even used it in a derisive manner when he was honoring Navajo code talkers?
Although we have a representative in Congress who they say was here a long time ago. They call her Pocahontas. But you know what? I like you because you are.
That was a really interesting moment in time. First of all, you had Navajo code talkers who served during World War II and, arguably helped the United States win that war. And they were sitting in front of a picture of Andrew Jackson, who is a notorious Indian fighter. He implemented the Indian removal policies that targeted the so-called 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, or the Muskogee. And he is held up as a hero, not just to Trump, but also other sitting American presidents. And before Andrew Jackson, you have presidents such as, George Washington, who was called by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy town destroyer for his extirpation of Iroquois villages in what is presently New York and the total war campaign that he waged against indigenous peoples during and after the Revolutionary War. So Trump upholding this brutal anti-Indian figure isn't anything new. And the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to this day calls every sitting president town destroyer in recognition that the United States is a foreign colonizing and occupying power. So when you have Indigenous people such as the Navajo Code Talkers who have served their country, who are just being humiliated by Trump, in front of this picture of Andrew Jackson, it's quintessential Americana in the sense that it's a purposeful forgetting. It's a purposeful distortion of what Native American identity is. It's a purposeful distortion of history and an actual historical figure. Pocahontas was a captive. She was sex trafficked. So to mobilize somebody who otherwise had a tragic life as a racial slur against your political opponent is, it cuts really deep to the bone of what this country is about.
You wrote this really provocative and I thought strong story for The Intercept. The title was Native American Sovereignty is Under Attack. Here's how Elizabeth Warren's DNA test hurt our struggle. And in it, you write, like many Native people, I'm jealous of Warren and white people like her. Native plebeians such as myself, a poor Indian kid born on the wrong side of the tracks in Podunk, South Dakota, lack her pedigree and life story. She might as well have rare Romanov ancestry, a secret but ill-fated royal bloodline when compared to my proletarian biography. Expand on that, Nick.
When I saw Elizabeth Warren's video that was released and seeing sort of this mythical, very Americana portrayal of her life story that, everyone has an Indigenous ancestor in their tree.
My mother was born in eastern Oklahoma. It had been Indian territory until just a few years earlier when it had become a state. My daddy always said he fell head over heels in love with my mother the first time he saw her. But my daddy's parents, the Herrings, were bitterly opposed to their marrying because my mother's family, the Reeds, was part Native American. This sort of discrimination.
It was a kind of a tongue-in-cheek comment, but I don't think some people were laughing as hard as I was, just because it's absurd. And the quote that I begin with from Vine Deloria about the assertion of an Indigenous identity as, something that's mythical has been, a common framework of American settler colonialism or U.S. settler colonialism, in that it purposely distorts Native American identity that could be laid claim to, just as land could be laid claim to. So like our bodies, our DNA, because DNA is part of our body, is up for grabs, just like our land, and so are our identities. And that's the way that the United States has treated Indigenous peoples and our land, but it also trivializes what are otherwise complicated questions of identity, because there are people out there. There are people in my own family who are out there who have been lost to us in the sense that they've been adopted out, they've been disappeared at boarding schools, they've been sterilized by the Indian Health Service, and we're still trying to find those people. This is a very serious matter, and it really glosses over this really complicated, very violent history of settler colonialism that is still ongoing. I don't know any other race of people who are, racialized with DNA the way that Native people are. And even Lindsey Graham has come out and said,
but you're going to find out in a couple of weeks, because I'm going to take this test.
You are going to take it.
I'm taking it, and the results are going to be revealed here. This is my Trump moment. This is reality TV.
Why do you want to
I'm dying to know. Because I'm dying. I didn't really think much about it, but she's less than 1/10 of 1%. I think I can beat her.
Right, and if you do beat her, will you ask for $1 million from the president too?
No, I want a casino and $1 million.
And that shows the level of disregard and disrespect that, U.S. politicians, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, have for Native sovereignty. And I would ask, Elizabeth Warren, I doubt she's listening to this program, why wouldn't you hold a rally or a march or some kind of press conference and use your visibility instead of responding for a tit for tat to Trump, but actually mobilize your base around issues such as the Texas court striking down the Indian Child Welfare Act or the disenfranchisement of North Dakota Native American voters. What it reveals to me is that the release of this information of her so-called Native American ancestry through a DNA test was pure political opportunism. It makes us seem like a football that either Trump or, Elizabeth Warren or now Lindsey Graham can kick around to their benefit when Native people themselves are facing serious challenges to their sovereignty. It trivializes those questions and it trivializes our issues.
I think a lot of people that listen to this show followed very closely the struggles of the water protectors and their allies in these battles against the pipelines, Dakota Access, Standing Rock being probably the most high profile. Give people a sense of what is happening across the country in these battles against, because it's not just the Dakota Access Pipeline. There's several other frontline battles that are being waged right now against these corporations and, in fact, the U.S. government.
There's this kind of like winner-takes-all mentality in the United States. And what most people didn't really follow or understand is that a lot of the people who showed up at Standing Rock were already part of movements. The indigenous peoples who were organizing on the ground in the Oceti-Sakowin, the Great Sioux Nation, they were already, organized to oppose the Keystone XL pipeline when it first came through. Or you had people from Minnesota, the Ojibwe people, who were already organized against Line 3. Or you had people that came from so-called Canada, the First Nations people, who were already organized against Enbridge, what we now know as Trudeau's pipeline. So the sort of convergence that happened at Standing Rock really signaled, in my mind, a sort of transformation taking place in Indigenous country as a political sort of like call to consciousness around the issues that are facing Indigenous people, but also the way that we interact with larger settler society. Unfortunately, settler society can selectively engage us however they choose to. So, for example, why is it that Elizabeth Warren is the topic that we're invited to talk shows on, or we're invited to give comment on, but we're not invited to talk about the fact that Native people are killed at the highest rate by police in this country, or that we face rates of incarceration and poverty that far exceed any demographic, or that we're facing existential threats to our water, our land, and even just keeping our children in their own homes. And people say, those are very complicated issues. That's not a soundbite. And so the corporate media, it's there to produce and commodify our stories so that they can be easily digestible. But I think it's such a cynical view of our country in the sense that we can't hold complicated ideas in our head to say that Elizabeth Warren's claim to Native ancestry or Lindsey Graham's claim to Native ancestry or Trump's use of Native people as a political football can also be talked about in the context of the current pipeline struggles that are happening around Bayou Bridge in Louisiana, or Line 3 up in Minnesota, or Keystone XL in Montana and South Dakota and in Nebraska. These are all things that can be talked about. I implore Native people who are listening to this podcast and elsewhere to think about the ways in which our issues are being framed in the media. And if we're constantly fighting just for representation and for these political elites to acknowledge us, for political elites to recognize our humanity, then we've already lost. The only reason why we had the Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975 was because we had the militant Red Power movement of the 1960s and 1970s that took Alcatraz.
To Alcatraz for the purpose of taking the island for all Indian people to have a place we could call Indian land.
It took Wounded Knee in 1973. But then also launched that campaign on the world stage in 1977, gaining international recognition for Indigenous peoples across the world. Those were historic gains that were made by everyday grassroots people. Nobody was looking to, the Elizabeth Warrens or the Trumps of the world to sit down and say, you know what, we recognize your humanity. They weren't asking for permission. They were taking it and they were organizing their own communities towards their own needs. But now we're listening to the radio and we're listening to these candidates, and they're silent on the issue of war. They're silent on the issue of backing up these imperialist powers, but also their own imperialism. And that's the thing about imperialism. We never get to vote on imperialism. We didn't get a vote on the Iraq War, but yet we allocate $750 billion of our defense budget every year to these things. And we know that Native American poverty and land claims could be solved tomorrow because the U.S. has those resources. And I don't think it's a lack of will on the part of an everyday American in the United States, whether they're Native, Black, or white, that they can sympathize with Native issues and that they do recognize that these issues are something that confront every American.
We've just heard clips today starting with Code Switch discussing Thanksgiving. Democracy Now! Spoke with historian Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz also about Thanksgiving. We heard from In the Thick in 2 parts on the Stolen Sisters. Science for the People interviewed Kim Tallbear about indigenous DNA. Code Switch continued the discussion on so-called Indian blood to point out that identity is about much more than blood. Democracy Now! Held a roundtable discussion about Elizabeth Warren's DNA test. And finally, we just heard Intercepted speaking with historian Nick Estes about how Native peoples and the issues that matter to them are so often trivialized. Members will be getting a bonus episode with a couple of additional clips, including a comedic look at Warren's DNA test, an example of media reporting poorly on opinion polls asking about the name of the Washington, D.C. football team, and I will muse for a bit on a decades-old comedy bit about how white politicians see Native people. So to hear all of that, to cast a weekly vote on what upcoming topics you want to hear on the show, and for other details about supporting the show by being a patron, visit patreon.com/bestoftheleft. You can find that link in the show notes on the device you're using to listen, which is also where you can find links to each of today's segments for easy reference and sharing. And now, we'll hear from you.
Hey Jay, it's Abdul calling from DC. Sorry, I'm a little nasally. I'm coming down with a cold. I just wanted to respond to the thread on privacy. I think you're absolutely correct in distinguishing the different types of privacy: government, personal, corporate, social. I also think that it's worth taking a second to distinguish between privacy and secrecy. Secrecy tends to be the sort of like handmaiden, right-wing man, servant of authoritarianism. In my work, for instance, I work with a lot of adult survivors of abuse or ongoing abuse, childhood sexual abuse, other types of abuse and neglect. And it seems like secrecy is always there at the heart of it. And I think you also see that kind of obsession with secrecy in the authoritarian regimes, East Germany, the Soviet Union, I imagine places like North Korea. And I think that we in the United States are sort of on that weird slippery slope because we are, marching towards fascism. And I think that the sort of like obsession with privacy/secrecy allows certain people to get away with holding or, despicable beliefs or participating in really deplorable actions. And in many ways, like you said, because we are social animals, the consequences for our actions come from other people knowing about them. And so privacy taken to its extreme of secrecy allows people to indulge in these sort of horrible thoughts and actions and still hope to get away with it without any social consequence.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Thanks to the volunteers who helped gather clips to make this show possible. Thanks to Amanda Hoffman for all of her work on our social media outlets and activism segments. And thanks to all those who called into the voicemail line. If you'd like to leave a comment or question of your own to be played on the show, you can simply record a message at 202-999-3991. Now, to finish off today, I have essentially an activism segment for you. So to catch us up on just the most recent horrible injustice befalling some Native people in this country, in a reversal of an Obama-era decision, the federal government ruled in September that the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe of Massachusetts does not qualify for a reservation. This decision has the power to take 321 acres of tribal land out of federal trust, effectively disestablishing the tribe's reservation and eliminating their self-governance. With this ruling, the Trump administration is unearthing a disgusting tactic the United States government has used to destroy tribes in the past. The only way to protect the tribal land now is for Congress to pass the bipartisan Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe Reservation Reaffirmation Act. If the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe sounds particularly familiar, it may be because this is the Native American tribe of the Thanksgiving origin story lore. The tribe says their ancestors have occupied the land in southeastern Massachusetts since before human memory. Here are just some of the tribal voices of the movement fighting to protect their legal right to the land.
No matter whose name is on papers, in whatever office, this land knows us as Indigenous. It knows us as one with it. Thank you so much for walking through Mashpee today. We needed to remind our neighbors that Indigenous people live here.
When we heard about the DOI decision to dispossess Mashpee people of what remains of their ancestral lands, we were shocked and appalled. Your right to occupy your traditional homeland is a right that the government cannot extinguish. For how can they extinguish something that they did not create?
We have to continue on. We need to get this bill passed because Congress has the authority to stop this in its tracks right now. We also have a responsibility to the other 127 tribes that got their federal acknowledgement after 1934. If they get us, they're coming for them too. So we need to stand up for our brothers and sisters as well as ourselves.
If they can do this to one of the most well-documented tribes in America, they can do this to any tribe. And in this march, we actually did the most sovereign thing possible, and that's simply walking on our land on our terms. This is powerful as Indigenous people, but us as common people, as Ikjewi-Chacha, people who come from a tradition of warriors, we have to look in ourselves and saying, what are we willing to do? What is at stake, and what are we willing to risk?
This is a perversion of justice. This is a perversion of truth. And we need to call it and name it for what it is. This is an extension of colonialism. This is genocide. This is an attempt to make us go extinct. We have less than 0.5% of our land, and they want to take that too. When is enough enough?
The blood and the bones that we stand on this land, it's the blood that flows through our systems. It's our genealogy, it's our life, it's our breath, it's the air that we breathe. I believe as we stand here today, people from our past, our ancestors, are standing right here with us. And it's that power that the Creator passed down to us, that power, that energy, that strength. And that's why Mashpee is still here today. The world needs to know that Mashpee stands strong today. And the world needs to stand with Mashpee.
We're going to take this fight, this walk, to the steps of the Department of Interior in Washington, D.C. First week in November. Be ready. Be ready. Stop touching.
You can help the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe reinstate their federal trust by calling your members of Congress in the House and Senate today to tell them to pass the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe Reservation Reaffirmation Act. Visit Mashpee, M-A-S-H-P-E-E, Wampanoag, W-A-M-P-A-N-O-A-G, tribe-nsn.gov to learn more and find out other ways to support the tribe in this fight. You can also help amplify this action by using the hashtag StandWithMashpee on social media. Now, for me, this is the important takeaway from this. So, for instance, I already have plans for a future episode that's going to focus on the relationship between imperialism and Native peoples. But the thing to know about it is that it's not over. The legacy of imperialism and colonization is not something that exists in the past, and the solution isn't just to come to terms with our history and right past wrongs or anything like that. It's about opposing the elements of imperialism, colonization, and systemic oppression in the here and now, because these patterns never stopped. They just changed shape. Of course, with the Trump administration, as usual, they've been kind enough to take the masks off and show their actions for exactly what they are. As always, I would love to hear your comments on this or anything else. The number to dial, 202-999-3991. That is going to be it for today. Thanks to everyone for listening. Thanks to those who support the show by becoming a member or making donations of any size at patreon.com/bestofleft, as that is absolutely how the program survives. Of course, everyone can support the show just by telling everyone you know about it and leaving us glowing reviews on Apple Podcasts and Facebook to help others find the show. For details on the show itself, including links to all of the sources and music used in this and every episode, all that information can always be found in the show notes on the blog and likely right on the device you're using to listen. So coming to you from far outside the conventional wisdom of Washington, D.C., my name is Jay, and this has been the Best of the Left podcast, coming to you every Tuesday and Friday, thanks entirely to the members and donors to the show from bestoftheleft.com.